He died without screaming, but his silence was louder than all the furnaces he ever lit. Erich Muhsfeldt, one of the darkest names of Nazism, was much more than an SS officer. He was the human face of hell. In the Auschwitz and Majdanek concentration camps, he became the master of fire, the man in charge of making thousands of bodies disappear, and of erasing every trace of the horror he himself helped to create. He was born in 1912 in Germany. His childhood was ordinary, with no evident signs of the monster he would become. But when Nazism gained strength, Muhsfeldt found in that regime the perfect space to give free rein to his cold and authoritarian nature. He soon joined the SS, and his blind obedience led to a rapid rise. However, it didn't take long for him to show that he wasn't just a simple soldier following orders. He was someone who enjoyed the power that death gave him. In the camps, his job was clear: to supervise the crematoria, to ensure no body was left unburned, that the machinery of extermination kept running without pause. But over time, that task became his personal stage for cruelty. Survivors described him as a man who smiled at suffering, who approached prisoners not to interrogate them, but to choose who would be the next to die. One of the most chilling testimonies describes him throwing people alive into the furnaces, not out of necessity, not by order, simply because he wanted to see what would happen. He did it calmly, without haste, like someone observing a routine. That was his true essence, the executioner who found pleasure in the despair of others. Muhsfeldt was not just another cog in the Nazi machine. He was an individual who enjoyed his role within it. That difference, the willingness to cause harm without needing to, made him one of the most disturbing cases within the Holocaust system. Even some of his own subordinates felt uncomfortable with him. And when other men of the regime begin to fear one of their own, something truly sick is happening. Now, subscribe and hit the bell, because here we reveal the faces behind the horror and the shadows that history tried to forget. In Majdanek, his name was synonymous with terror. The prisoners knew that a simple exchange of glances could seal their fate. Muhsfeldt was calculating, and he used fear as a tool. Sometimes he ordered public executions to maintain control. Other times, he simply observed from a distance, making sure everyone understood who decided who lived and who did not. There are accounts that show him walking among the furnaces as if they were part of his identity. He checked the temperatures, adjusted the hatches, gave precise orders for everything to function without pause. He didn't do it for efficiency, but for control. The fire was his domain, and within that hell he helped maintain, he seemed to feel at home. When the war neared its end, he tried to erase his tracks. He burned documents, destroyed lists, and tried to blend in with the prisoners evacuating the camps. But his face was known, his name feared. It didn't take long before he was captured. In 1945, he was brought before the courts that would change history. The prosecutors presented evidence that shook everyone: testimonies, documents, orders signed by him, and accounts from witnesses who had seen the unthinkable. Each word painted a clearer picture of the monster he had been. The survivors narrated how he laughed while bodies piled up, how he ordered the cremations to be accelerated to erase traces of life, how sometimes, on a mere impulse, he would choose someone at random and make them disappear into the fire. The tribunal listened to every word in silence. Some could not hold back their tears. Others simply did not understand how a human being could cross so many limits. But the evidence was undeniable. There were no excuses, no ideology, no context that could justify that. It was evil in its purest form, without a mask or political discourse to cover it. Muhsfeldt tried to defend himself with the classic argument, "I was only following orders." But that phrase, which many others used in vain, became hollow in his mouth. There was no obedience in his pleasure. There was no discipline in his sadism, and the tribunal knew it. He was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The sentence, death by hanging. On the day of his execution, there were no speeches or pleas. He did not try to justify himself, nor did he ask for forgiveness. He simply walked to the scaffold with the same coldness with which he had led thousands to their deaths. The guards described him as an empty man. No trace remained of the arrogant officer or the executioner who thought he was untouchable, just a body walking towards its end. The rope fell with precision, and in a matter of seconds, silence. No honors, no flowers, no epitaph. The very fire he had controlled so many times in the crematoria did not receive him. He was cremated without a name, without a grave, without glory, wiped off the map, but not from memory. Despite his execution, the echo of his crimes continued to resonate. Subsequent trials cited his name again and again as an example of absolute dehumanization. Even among the Nazis themselves, there were those who remembered him with revulsion. Some witnesses stated that Muhsfeldt represented the total loss of morality within the system. His story was studied by historians and psychologists for decades, trying to understand what kind of mind could find satisfaction in the suffering of others. The conclusions were terrifying. It was not about madness, but conscious coldness. The monster knew what he was doing, and he enjoyed it. Therefore, when his body disintegrated in the crematorium, many felt that not just a man was dying, but a living warning. A reminder that evil, when disguised as obedience, can happen again if the world lets its guard down. His death was quick, almost painless, and that paradox is perhaps the most unjust thing. The man who prolonged the pain of others to an unspeakable degree died without feeling it. But justice, at least, had spoken. Not as revenge, but as closure. Because the world needed to say, never again. The case of Erich Muhsfeldt was key to the development of the modern concept of crimes against humanity. In the post-war trials, his name served as an example of how wickedness can manifest not only in totalitarian systems, but also in individuals who feel protected by them. Society then understood that horror does not always come from above. Sometimes it is born from the simple pleasure of destruction. Today, his story survives, not to remember him, but to remind us of what we are capable of allowing when empathy disappears. Muhsfeldt was the darkest mirror of the human being. He had no redemption, nor did he seek forgiveness. He died without understanding that his name would not be forgotten, but condemned to remain as a symbol of what must never be repeated. And although his body was reduced to ashes, his legacy was etched into every testimony of those who survived. Every word from his victims remains a cry against silence, a warning against indifference, a lesson about what happens when power combines with sadism. Erich Muhsfeldt was not an obedient soldier. He was an executioner who found pleasure in suffering, and his end, as swift as it was deserved, was not enough to balance the weight of his crimes. But it did serve to remind the world that even in the darkest of times, justice eventually catches up with those who defy it. His story is the echo of a human hell, a scar that must not be erased, because only by understanding the magnitude of the cruelty that resided in men like him can we avoid repeating it. And while time erases names and dates, the voices of the survivors remain alive. They were the true witnesses of the trial, those who managed to look the executioner in the eye and see that, behind the uniform, there was nothing but emptiness. Erich Muhsfeldt died by hanging, but memory continues to judge him every day, every time someone asks how so much evil was possible. And that is why these stories must be told, because to forget is to allow the monster to awaken again. But this is part of our world history. If you liked the information, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to see more content like this. Give us a like and comment on what you want our next video to be. See you soon.